Ever feel like, you're on that hamster wheel? Giving and giving and giving, and then suddenly you have nothing left for yourself.
Oh, tell me about it.
We are diving into Boundaries today
Yes.
by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend, and this book.
I love this book.
Oh, it's so good, right?
So good.
It's like a survival guide, honestly,
For sure.
to like existing
Yeah.
in the world.
With other humans.
Yes.
It's so easy to get caught up in, I feel like the world's telling us constantly, just give more, give more, give more.
Yeah.
And then you reach a certain point, and you're like, I have nothing left.
You're just a puddle.
You're an empty shell.
Yes.
And that's not healthy.
No, not at all. And, it's funny because I think people hear the word boundaries and they think, oh, it's about being selfish or it's about shutting people out. But it's not that at all.
No, not at all. It's really about respect.
Yeah.
Respect for yourself, respect for others. And I think the book does a really good job of framing that from the get-go.
It does, because it's really about figuring out where, like, your lawn ends.
Yes.
And your neighbor's lawn begins.
Yeah.
And believing you have a right to say, hey, you need to water your own grass.
Exactly. And it starts with this, I think, very relatable but kind of sad story about Sherry.
Oh, Sherry, yeah.
Who's constantly bombarded.
Yeah.
With demands. I mean, everybody just wants a piece of Sherry.
Right. Like, phone's ringing off the hook. Kids are, like, yelling at her.
And she just keeps saying yes.
It made me realize how often I do that, where it's just like, oh, yeah, I can do that. I can squeeze that in. And then you're like, wait, why am I so miserable?
Totally. And why we think, I think sometimes,
Yeah.
that being nice means just saying yes to everything.
Yeah.
And it really doesn't.
And it sets up this expectation, I think, as well.
For sure, yeah.
If I'm always the yes person.
And that's where that whole analogy of the fence, right?
Oh, yes, the fence. I love that.
The fence with the gate.
Yes. Tell me more about that, because I think that's so powerful.
Yeah, I think it's such a good visual, right?
Yeah.
Because you need to be both permeable but also protected.
Okay, I like that.
Right. So you're letting the good stuff in, keeping the bad stuff out.
Yeah.
But you get to decide what that is, right?
So it's like having a filter
Yes.
on your life and only letting in what serves you, what aligns with your values, what you know, what you want to be giving your energy to.
Exactly.
It's not just saying yes to every single thing that comes along.
And I think, too, it's knowing that you have that power to filter.
Yeah.
Because I feel like so often, or at least for me personally, I'd find myself in situations where I felt very much like I have no choice. I have to say yes to this.
Yeah.
And the book really emphasizes that, no, you do have a choice.
You always have a choice.
And sometimes that choice is using our words.
Ooh, okay. I like that. So words as in actually speaking up for ourselves.
Speaking up, setting those boundaries.
Mm.
Because you can have that gate, you can have that fence, but you also need to be able to communicate like, hey, this is the perimeter.
Yes, I love that. And sometimes that feels so difficult though, right?
It does.
To actually speak up and say like no or...
Especially to people that we love. And we don't want to disappoint,
Yeah.
We want them to think that we are coming from a good place. And
We want to be nice.
Yeah, we want to be helpful. And saying no sometimes feels like the opposite of that.
It does, yeah.
But the book does a really good job of explaining, like actually saying no can be the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for the other person.
It's true. And for some reason, we think being loving means just like being a pushover.
Yes, 100%.
And just letting people, walk all over our metaphorical lawns.
Yes, exactly.
So how do we actually do that then? How do we start to use our words to set those boundaries? Because I think a lot of us, myself included, sometimes we know what we should do, but actually putting it into practice.
Totally. That's the hard part.
That's the hurdle.
And I think what the book does a good job of, which we'll get into, but one of the things is it gives us some tools, like some actual practical tips. Like they talk about the power of no as a complete sentence. You don't need to over-explain or justify.
Well, wait, hold on, back up. No is a complete sentence.
A complete sentence.
Well, that is revolutionary.
Mic drop. You can just say no.
I feel like I need to practice that.
Right. Because so often we feel like, especially I think as women, we're taught to kind of soften it. We've got to kind of...
Oh, yeah, we over-explain.
Over-explain, justify, make sure everyone's okay. Like, oh, I'm so sorry. I
already have plans. And then you list the plans.
Yes, but maybe. No.
Yeah.
No, it's just, no, I can't do that right now.
Right.
Done. Period. End of sentence.
Okay. Permission to just say no.
I love that.
Yeah.
But it's scary, though. It's scary because...
It is scary.
Because what if they get mad?
Yes.
What if they reject me? All those fears come up.
Of course. And the book addresses that. They talk about how, it might be uncomfortable at first, people might not be used to it, but over time, as you start to set those boundaries and people realize like, oh, they're serious.
Like, I'm not messing around with my lawn. This is my property line.
This is my property line. You can come over, but like, don't walk on my flowers.
Don't walk on my flowers.
Exactly. And I think, too, it's not just about those external boundaries with other people. It's those internal boundaries, too.
Ooh, tell me more about that because I struggle with that one. Me too. This is a constant, I think, evolution for all of us. But it's that, those moments when you're about to order takeout for the third night in a row?
Yeah.
That's a prime opportunity for a boundary check-in.
Okay. So it's that little voice that's like, one more episode won't hurt.
Or just one more cookie.
Yes.
I'll start eating healthy tomorrow.
Oh, yeah. Tomorrow. Tomorrow's the day.
It's that recognizing that we have the power to say no to ourselves as well as to other people.
It's almost like you have to parent yourself.
Yes, 100%.
A little bit.
Be that inner parent. Yeah.
Where you're like, no, we're not doing that.
And I think it's interesting because they talk about, and we'll probably get into this more too, but how our upbringing can shape those internal boundaries.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Because if you grew up in a home where there weren't a lot of boundaries.
Right. Either too rigid or too loosey-goosey.
Right, exactly. Like, where do you even begin?
It's learned. We learn it. And we can relearn it too.
I love that. That's hopeful.
Yeah. Because you might have had a really, chaotic upbringing or one where there were no boundaries. And you come into adulthood and you're like, whoa, this is a free-for-all. And I don't know how to manage all this.
Yeah. Everybody's in my business all the time.
Yes. And that can feel very overwhelming.
Yeah.
But we could learn how to do it differently.
That's good. Okay, so then how do we start to, reparent ourselves or learn these skills if we didn't have them growing up?
Well, that's where the book's 10 Laws of Boundaries comes in.
Okay, 10 laws, like the 10 commandments of boundaries.
Exactly. But they're less like these strict rules.
Okay, good.
And more like these guiding principles for navigating this often very tricky terrain, right?
Because it can be a minefield.
Oh, for sure.
Especially if you're starting to set boundaries for the first time.
Yes, or if you're dealing with people who are not used to you having them.
Okay, so then tell me about these laws. Like, where do we even begin?
Well, I think a great place to start is with the foundation. The law of sowing and reaping.
Ooh, that sounds juicy. Okay, we'll dive into that right after this break. Okay, so the law of sowing and reaping, it sounds a little bit like karma for boundaries.
Right, like what goes around comes around.
Yeah, exactly.
But in our relationships.
Okay, so if I'm planting yes seeds everywhere.
You're going to get a whole lot of yes situations.
Even when I don't want them.
Exactly. And that can lead to feeling resentful, overwhelmed, like you're constantly giving more than you're getting back.
Okay, so then what am I supposed to do? Like, just stop watering my relationships completely? Because that doesn't sound good either.
No, it's not about cutting people off. It's about being mindful of what you're planting. So if you're constantly saying yes when you want to say no, if you're always putting other people's needs before your own.
Setting myself up for a whole garden of resentment.
Exactly. But if you start setting those boundaries, even if it's just small ones at first, it's like planting those seeds for healthier, more balanced relationships.
Okay, so it's like, I can still water your lawn, but I'm also going to put up a little fence so my flowers don't get trampled.
Exactly. You're not cutting them off, you're just setting some limits. And it might take a while to see those changes.
Because gardening takes time.
Exactly. But it's worth it. Those healthy relationships, they're going to be so much more beautiful and rewarding in the long run.
Okay, I'm liking this gardening analogy. So we're planting seeds, setting boundaries, but then what? What's the next step in this whole process?
Well, the law of responsibility goes hand in hand with the law of sowing and reaping. It's about recognizing that we are responsible to the people in our lives, to love them, to support them.
To be good humans.
Yes, but we are not responsible for them.
Okay, hold on. I need to write that down. Responsible to, not for. That's huge.
Right, because we can't control other people. We can't make them happy. We can't fix their problems.
Oh, that's hard, though. Especially when you love someone and you see them struggling. It's like that instinct to jump in and save the day is so strong.
It is. But when we try to take on that responsibility that isn't ours, we end up feeling resentful, overwhelmed, and honestly, it's not even helpful for the other person.
It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. You can't show up as your best self in your relationships if you're constantly trying to carry the weight of everyone else's problems. And sometimes the most loving thing we can do is step back, and allow those people to experience the natural consequences of their choices.
Okay, I get that. But how do you actually do that? Because it's one thing to say, I'm not responsible for your happiness, but it's another thing to actually, like, let someone fall down when you have the power to catch them.
It's tough. It takes practice. But the book gives some good strategies for setting those boundaries, like using I statements, for example. So instead of saying, you always do this, which is just going to make the other person defensive,
Because who wants to hear that?
right? Instead, you can say something like, when you do this, it makes me feel.
Okay, so it's less about blaming and more about communicating how their actions are impacting you.
Exactly. And that's a much more effective way to set those boundaries because you're not attacking them. You're just owning your own experience.
I like that. It's about taking back your power.
Exactly. And that actually leads us perfectly into the law of power.
Ooh, here we go. Now I'm going to get to control everything with my mind.
Not exactly. This one is actually about recognizing our lack of power. We can't control other people's choices or reactions. We can't force them to change.
Okay, so less about mind control, more about...
More about recognizing that the only thing we can control is ourselves, our choices, how we respond to other people.
So it's about focusing on our own lane, right? Staying in our own yard, metaphorically speaking.
Exactly. And that can be really empowering because it means that we're not at the mercy of other people's moods or actions. We get to decide how we show up in the world, regardless of what's going on around us.
I like that. It takes a lot of pressure off, actually.
It does, because when we let go of that need to control everything and everyone around us, we free ourselves up to focus on what we can control, which is ourselves. And that's where the real magic happens.
Okay, I'm here for that. But let's talk about where this gets really tricky. What about family? Because family is supposed to be like this unconditional love, always there for you kind of thing. But sometimes that can make setting boundaries extra challenging.
Oh, 100%. In some ways, family can be the hardest place to set boundaries because those relationships are so deeply ingrained. We've been conditioned from childhood to play certain roles, to behave in certain ways.
It's like those patterns get baked in from the beginning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it can be really hard to break free from them, even when we know they're not healthy for us. But the book emphasizes that setting boundaries with family is just as important, if not more important, than in any other relationship.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we start to rewrite those old patterns and set those boundaries without, like, destroying our families in the process?
It's about communication, first and foremost. Having those open and honest conversations with our families about what our needs are, what our limits are. And that might be uncomfortable at first.
Especially if those conversations have never happened before.
Right. But it's about approaching it from a place of love and respect. And remember, setting boundaries isn't about punishing anyone or rejecting them. It's about honoring your own needs and creating healthy space for yourself.
So it's not selfish to say, hey, I love you, but I need some space.
Not at all. It's actually the opposite of selfish. Because when we take care of our own needs, we're better able to show up for the people we love.
That makes sense. But what about those situations where, you've tried to set those boundaries with family, but they just keep getting bulldozed over? What do you do then?
That's when you might need to set some firmer boundaries. And that might look like saying no more often, or limiting contact with certain family member.
Like, I'm not coming to Thanksgiving this year. That's a big one.
It can be a big one. And it's not always easy, but sometimes it's necessary. Especially if those family members are constantly disrespectful of your boundaries or if they're engaging in toxic behavior.
So sometimes the healthiest boundary is distance.
Sometimes. And that doesn't mean you don't love them. It just means you're prioritizing your own well-being.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've tackled family. What about friends? Because friendships can be just as complicated, right?
Oh, totally. And the book emphasizes that healthy friendships, just like any healthy relationship, are built on mutual respect, support, and reciprocity.
Reciprocity.
Right.
Okay, so it's not about keeping score, but there should be a balance.
Exactly. It can't be one-sided. We've all had that friend who's always asking for favors, but then disappears when we need something. Or that friend who constantly dumps their drama on us, but never seems to want to hear about our lives.
Oh, yeah, I've been there. It's
I know.
exhausting.
It is. And it's a recipe for resentment. So setting boundaries in friendships is about recognizing that it's okay to have different needs, to have different opinions, to even disagree. And it's about communicating those needs clearly and directly.
And sometimes that means having those tough conversations, right? Like, hey, I love you, but I can't be your therapist anymore. Or I need you to stop asking me for money.
Exactly. And those conversations can be hard. But true friends will respect those boundaries. They might not like it at first.
Yeah, they might push back.
They might. But ultimately, they'll understand that you're coming from a place of love, that you're just trying to take care of yourself.
And if they don't,
That's okay, too. Sometimes we have to let go of friendships that are no longer serving us. It's not always easy, but it's okay to choose ourselves.
okay, I'm feeling empowered already. But I feel like there's one more big one we need to talk about. Romantic relationships. Because talk about a breeding ground for boundary issues. It's like all those other relationships, family, friends, they all come crashing together in romantic relationships.
That's true. And the stakes feel so much higher.
Because you're talking about building a life with someone, potentially. And if you haven't figured out your own boundaries first.
You're setting yourself up for a world of hurt.
Exactly. So how do we set those boundaries in romantic relationships? Where do we even begin?
Well, the book emphasizes that the most important boundary you can set in a romantic relationship is with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It's about knowing your own needs, your own values, your own non-negotiables.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've covered, like, a lot of ground here
We have
about boundaries. We've talked about
all the things.
family and friends, romance, even the workplace. I mean, it sounds like
That's everywhere. Right?
nowhere is safe
Yeah.
from those, like, blurry lines, you know?
Yeah, and I think, we've laid out all these, like, laws and principles, and it can feel, I think, overwhelming.
Oh, totally.
Actually, like, okay, how do we put this into practice?
Yeah, because it's one thing to, like, read about it in a book and be like, oh, yeah, I should totally set more boundaries. But then when you're actually in the moment
Right.
and, like, that person's asking you for that thing or you're about to do that thing you said you weren't going to do, it's like,
It's hard.
it's so much harder.
It's so much harder to actually do it.
Yeah, it's like that knowing doing gap or something.
Yes, totally.
That's like, oh, yeah, I should work out. Oh, yeah, I should set boundaries. And
Yeah.
then it's like, but, like, Netflix.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
and rhyme.
Exactly, and that's why I think, the book does a good job of saying start small.
Okay, I like that. Baby steps.
Baby steps. You don't have to go from, like, 0 to 60.
Do you have any, like, tips for starting small? Because I think that would be really helpful. Because I get overwhelmed easily.
Me too. And I think a great place to start is actually with those internal boundaries.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So those are the boundaries that we set with ourselves.
Okay, so, like, my self-talk.
Self-talk, your actions, like that little voice that says, like, one more episode won't hurt. At 2 in the morning.
Or one more glass of wine, or
Yes.
all of the things.
Scrolling Instagram until what time is it even?
It's recognizing those moments where we're about to sabotage ourselves,
Oh.
right? And making a different choice. Because every time, I truly believe this, every time we choose to honor that boundary with ourselves,
It gets a little bit easier.
it does. It builds that muscle.
It's like a muscle.
Yes.
You're building those boundary muscles.
Boundary muscles, exactly.
So you start by, like, saying no to that extra glass of wine.
Yes.
Or, like, saying no to that thing that you know is going to make you feel bad later.
Totally.
And then all of a sudden, it's like, oh, I can say no to my mother-in-law now. Exactly. If you can say no to the chips and salsa.
Oh, that's the hardest one.
It is.
But yeah, I get what you're saying. It's like you build up to those bigger boundaries.
You build that confidence, for sure.
Okay, so we're starting small, we're building our boundary muscles. But what about those conversations with other people? Because I think that's where I get really tripped up, is actually having to, like, speak the words out loud.
The words,
Yes.
it feels so confrontational,
It does.
but it doesn't have to be.
Okay, good.
And the book gives some great tips on this. And one of the things they talk about is, remember we talked about I statements?
Yes, tell me more about that.
So instead of you saying, like, you're always late, which again is going to make the other person defensive.
Because nobody wants to be always anything.
Right, exactly.
Except for maybe, like, always awesome.
That you can be.
I'll take it.
You're always awesome at setting boundaries, but, instead of saying you're always late, you could say something like, when you're late, it makes me feel
Okay.
disrespected, or like my time is invaluable, whatever it is you're feeling.
So you're not blaming them, you're just stating, like, hey, this is how this impacts me.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm owning my own experience instead of, like, pointing the finger.
Yes. And I think that's so important. It takes practice.
It does. Everything takes practice, right?
It does.
Adulting is just one big practice session.
It really is. But the more you do it, the easier it gets.
Okay. So let's say I'm using my I statements. I'm, like, trying to set these boundaries, but the person's not responding well, or they're trying to, like, bulldoze over my boundaries. What do I do then?
That's where the assertiveness comes in. And I don't mean, like, being aggressive, but like being firm and clear about what you're willing to tolerate
Okay.
and what you're not.
So what does that sound like? What are some things I could say? Because I think that's, again, easier said than done, you know?
Right, totally. And the book actually gives some great phrases that you can use,
Oh, perfect.
like things like, I understand how you feel, but I'm not comfortable with that.
Oh, I like that. Okay, write that down, everybody.
Oh, I appreciate your offer, but I need to decline. Like, keep it simple,
Okay.
keep it direct, and don't be afraid to repeat yourself.
Because sometimes you have to, like, channel your inner toddler and just be like, no, 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 no.
Exactly. And sometimes, despite our best efforts, those conversations, they can get heated.
Oh, for sure. And then all of a sudden you're like back in your childhood bedroom, yelling at your mom about why you can't go to the mall.
Totally.
It can get messy.
It can. And when that happens, it's okay to, like, tap out of the conversation.
What do you mean?
Like, you can say, you know what? I think we both need a minute to cool down, or I'm not going to continue this conversation if you're going to yell at me, and just walk away.
So sometimes the healthiest boundary is just like, peace out, I'm out of here.
Exactly.
Okay, permission to leave the conversation. I like that.
Give yourself permission.
So we've covered so much good stuff here, but if you could leave our listeners with like one final thought, what would it be?
I would say this. Setting boundaries is not selfish. It's an act of self-love. It's about honoring your own needs and limits. And when you do that, you actually show up as a better friend, a better partner, a better family member. You're able to give from a place of fullness instead of resentment.
I love that. It's about filling up your own cup first so you can then share your overflow with others.
Exactly.
And it's about creating those healthier, more fulfilling relationships in the process.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been another deep dive, everybody. We'll catch you on the next one.